I'd like to invite Steph Bullen back up, but joining Steph will be Sarah Bolton. So Sarah Bolton, also a colleague of mine from DA. Sarah's a veterinarian by trade, has been working in private practice, but also worked for the Rural Land Protection Board in New South Wales prior to moving on and doing a Nuffield Scholarship in calf outcomes and cow-calf separation. That took her all around the world, and in particular to some relationships she's now got going with some welfare experts in Canada. For the last couple of years, she's been working as the project lead for animal welfare for DA. And for those of you in the room, you'll note that she has the most meeting theme appropriate footwear of anyone in the room today. So I just want to put that out there. Sarah, Steph, welcome. And they're going to be looking at some alternate technologies which can be used in concert with genomic testing. Thanks, ladies.
Are we going to jump up together and then I'll... Okay. Just working on our plan. And thanks, JP. I knew that you would point out the shoes in introducing me. Pleasure to be here. For those of you that don't know me, or for those of you who do know me rather, you'll know that I like to focus very much on the high level things. So whilst today's been a fabulous discussion around getting into the details of genetics and genomics, at multiple points in the previous presentations, there's been some really great references to not just how we're managing the replacement heifer component of the annual calf drop, but also how we're managing the non-replacement or the surplus component as well. So our aim for this session my aim in this particular part is to go through a little bit higher level overview of where that conversation's at, both here in Australia and internationally as well, and where it's likely to be headed. And I'll point out as well that there are a few slides in here that have come from some colleagues who really wanted to be here today but weren't able to make it. So there's some in here from Jasira Perovic, who works in meat standards at MLA, and some from Cam Renshaw, who operates the Calf-Link business in Northern Victoria, rearing dairy beef calves. So full credit to them for their contribution to this slide deck. So at a couple of points today, the word sustainability has been mentioned, and I always like to anchor this conversation with a little bit more of an exploration around what sustainability really is. I think quite often when we think or talk about sustainability, we usually focus on the environmental piece, which we always have up until this point, but it's really helpful to think about sustainability in a slightly wider context, at this point in time and heading into the future as well. So environmental sustainability is a given, and there's been quite a lot of focus today on the economic piece as well. We're all operating businesses, we're feeding the world, and making sure that a particular practice at least breaks even, if not earns the business money, is really vital to the sustainability of that particular practice going forward. But more and more, there's this piece around the idea of social sustainability or social license to operate or public trust preservation. And the key thing here with this diagram that was originally produced by a colleague in Canada, Professor Nina von Kaiserlink, is that all these pieces have to work together. So we can't operate in a particular way because it earns us money if it also meets with public disapproval. It's not going to be sustainable going forward. And equally, we can't just change what we do to look lovely and warm and fluffy if it's not earning the business money or the business is bleeding money as a result of that particular practice change. And increasingly, when it comes to this conversation around how we manage the annual calf drop, particularly as it relates to beef crossbred calves, the environmental piece is actually a key opportunity as well, because if we can be more targeted with what animals we're breeding, who we're breeding them from, and what markets they're entering, we have the opportunity to actually produce more protein from the herd each year, whether that's in the form of milk or meat, and therefore potentially have positive impacts on our carbon footprint. So really, people, planet, profit is the big thing, but because I'm an animal welfare person, it's people, planet, profit, animals, because underpinning all those three things is the actual scientific standards of animal welfare that comes underneath it. So looking globally at where the conversation is at around surplus or non-replacement calves, there is quite a big shift towards trying to increase that social sustainability piece. So a few years ago now in the UK, ALA came out with a set of sustainability standards that stipulated that no calves or no healthy calves can be euthanized before 8 weeks of age. The ICOS, which is the Irish Co-op Organisation Society, if I've got the acronym right, has a calf welfare charter that again stipulates no healthy calf euthanasia. Denmark will ban the practice from 2022. The UK has their GB bull calf strategy, which uses the terminology responsible breeding strategies, which we'll delve into a little bit more in a second. And I've already had two people today come and say to me, did you know that Fonterra New Zealand has come out with a new requirement around bobby calves? They're not moving away from bobby calf slaughter. Their Fonterra statement is that all calves will enter a value chain, which can still include bobby calf or early life slaughter pathways off farm. This is really interesting because New Zealand has a huge challenge when it comes to actually being able to rear all the calves that are born to their annual dairy herd every year when you consider the number of cows, the amount of land and the competition from sheep and beef. So yes, New Zealand is starting to look at this, but they're a very long way from what's happening in Europe above. The focus on early life slaughter, or the focus on euthanasia rather, is because that the European countries are listed here don't have a huge reliance on bobby calf slaughter at abattoirs. So the focus is mainly on at-birth euthanasia on farm. So the GB bull calf strategy, the commitment is that the dairy industry will rear all calves with care and eliminate healthy calf euthanasia by 2023. And so this is the piece that I think is really interesting for people in the room. So the language around responsible breeding strategies, and essentially putting as much or more effort into ensuring that the surplus or non-replacement component of the calf drop are actually purpose-bred for their market. So the tools that have been discussed today and the breeding strategies that have been, focused on heading into the future lend themselves really nicely to starting to look at how we can do this better as well. This slide is from Jasira Perovic at MLA, and this isn't going to be news to anyone here in the room, but essentially, why hasn't this beef on dairy game in Australia been successful up until this point? Really, it's because in that that triad of sustainability principles, it's been the economic factor that has dominated, which makes sense because we're operating businesses. So from a dairy business point of view, obviously rearing extra calves is competing for resources, historical poor experiences with prices, extra time, extra labour, extra infrastructure, etc. From a processor or a beef processor point of view, issues with cattle, carcass conformation, being too tall and heavy or too lean, producing poor manufacturing product and being seen as not worth paying reasonable margins for. But this is a vicious cycle in that when a dairy farmer grows an animal, sells it to a beef market and receives a poor price, reduce confidence in return on investment, reduce cost of production for that animal next time round. And we know that from recent research, we get the best quality carcasses from these animals when they're on the highest growth pathways for whole of life, which requires an increased cost of production and an increased confidence in return on investment. So unsurprisingly, if we look historically, this plots the number of bobby calves sent to abattoirs at 5 days of age each year against the Eastern Young Cattle Indicator, which is basically our beef commodity price. So they're more or less inversely proportional, indicating unsurprisingly that when beef prices are good, dairy farmers retain more calves or sell them on Gumtree, and when beef prices are poor, more calves go over the hooks at 5 days of age. So this slide is one borrowed from Cam Renshaw, and I think this is the real opportunity when it comes to having these discussions with dairy farmers in terms of the small differences that can be made at a herd level to ensure that we are moving more towards this idea of a responsible breeding strategy and purpose breeding surplus calves for their market with almost as much focus as what we might breed our replacement heifers. So this is very much a qualitative and non-scientific example, but this is Cam's slide really depicting a very well-bred calf, and with similar management, a not so well-bred calf that the beef market is going to be far less likely to desire. And again, the difference front on with these guys, for similar input costs, similar cost of production, we're going to get a far better carcass off the guy on the left, with the difference being at the level of the straw. So things to be factored in. Again, this is Cam's slide that he's partnered with CMEX to pull together, but starting to think about things not just at the level of the dairy herd when it comes to selecting beef size to use over the dairy herd. Obviously we want them to be high calving ease, but on the flip side, we don't want them to be compromising the quality of the calf. So there have been some issues with going for really high calving ease beef size over the dairy cow and having poor quality calves hit the ground. We need to make sure that we're also selecting for that calf quality so that it's being bred for the beef market as well. So considering things like whether or not the animal's polled, coat colour can attract a premium in the market, but performance, feeding ability and marbling as well. Remembering to factor in the fact that Jersey and Holstein animals tend to marble really highly, it's carcass conformation where they fall down. So being able to select for improved carcass conformation is really the opportunity here. And again, this is just Sierras that, just really trying to emphasise the fact that your market and your back pocket want really nicely grown steers as opposed to the big rangy coat hangers that have been chucked out in the back blocks for a couple of years and pulled in when somebody needs some extra cash and just heading into whatever market seems good at the time. So I guess the take-home message from me is, can we be more strategic about every calf that's being born to the herd? What's the opportunity in that? And how can we have more of a focus on that triad of sustainability as opposed to just the economic piece?
Thanks, Sarah.
It's a
Same slide deck. We were trying to be really efficient. Sorry. We were too efficient, Sarah.
We're too used to running our own show.
We are. So on Sarah's presentation, there should be a green slide on sex semen. Sorry, everyone. Yep, scroll down. Yeah. There it is, green slide. Beautiful. Awesome, look at that. Now, I think we've lost our seamless transition, Sarah, that we were... So you finished by talking about being really strategic, and that's kind of where I wanted to pick up the rest of this discussion around. So Sarah's talked about opportunities for non-replacement calves, and I suppose I wanted to talk about opportunities for replacement calves. So the specific brief that I had was to talk about sex semen, but I know much less about sex semen than you guys do, and I think, we know well that the evolution of technology, particularly things like fresh sex semen, means that kind of all those big barriers to the use of sex semen have really declined. And so talking about the performance of sex semen to an audience like you is probably less relevant. But what I wanted to do was to really pull together the key points out of Sarah's presentation, and that I've picked up in almost every presentation today, is around thinking strategically and stopping this zigzag. I think it was Matt A that said, one of the things that frustrates me the most is when farmers zigzag in their results. E. Chang, I think you said, yes, daughter fertility is working, but you have to do it consistently. So that's what I'm going to talk to you about today. So in the context of sex semen, why are we using sex semen? And I think if we're talking to a farmer that's pretty used to working in that really operational headspace, they'd say to produce more females. Of course, it's obvious. I want to capitalise on the export market. I want to breed more replacements. I want to breed better replacements. But actually the question really should be, are we using that as strategically as we can be? Are we on the best, most efficient path to get where we want to be in 5 or 10 years' time? And Shona, my question to you around what does your herd look like in 5 or 10 years' time was a little bit leading, because I was interested in your answer for my presentation. So just a quick hands up in the audience. Who's heard of Dairy Australia's Our Farm, Our Plan program? Yep, leave your hands up if you've done it. Not many. Okay, the key take home from me is jump in and sit on an Our Farm, Our Plan program. If you're a farmer, do it as a participant. Cannot rate the program highly enough. But one of the kind of opening parts of our Farm Our Plan is really talking about whether we're working in this kind of operational space, which is where farmers are kind of used to working. So you guys that work in genetics and herd improvement, an operational decision would be which bulls am I going to choose? I've got my autumn joining coming up, which bulls am I going to use this mating period? And what our Farm Our Plan really tries to do is to get farmers thinking much more strategically, which I'm very happy to admit, having a partner who's a dairy farmer, is somewhere where we tend to get too busy and too bogged down to think about routinely. So as I said, highly recommend getting along to our Farm Our Plan program, and you can go as a service provider and just sit in. But really amazing program, which looks to really get farmers thinking about where do they want to be, what are their business goals, Shona, what is the type of cow that suits my farm, and am I actually making the right operational decisions to get where I want to be? And the reason why I'm emphasising this is because we actually have a goal as an industry to get over 80% of dairy farm businesses performing systematic periodic business reviews at least annually. So it's a real opportunity for you guys as service providers to harness on the back of an industry program. Our Farm Our Plan is about whole business performance, key areas, whether it's animals, whether it's pasture, whether it's risk. But a key part of that is obviously my herd. Our herd's the second biggest asset on a dairy farm, so let's make sure we've got that captured. I reckon in a lot of the conversations I have, unless you're working in this place, Sarah, like you and I are often, these just buzzwords, operational and strategic, sort of make people glaze over. And so the question I like to ask is, what does good look like for you? Whether that's 10 years, whether that's 5 years, 10 years maybe is more realistic for something like genetics that's slower, but that's really hard to think about. So let's think about what good looks like in 5 years. So for your business, so Shona or Rob, when you were farming, there's a couple of other farmers I know that are online. What does good look like? Do you want to have bobby calves or not? And certainly from, the slides that Sarah showed, is that we're moving away from this early life slaughter. And so perhaps that's something we really need to start thinking about. What does our budget say is suitable for our business? So picking up from Jake's presentation, is it profitable actually to be rearing all those surplus replacements and targeting the export market? If it's going to cost us $2,200 to rear them and we're only getting $1,600 for it, I would argue that that's not a very sensible investment. So thinking about where do I sit? Am I the blue line or am I the orange line on Jake's presentation? And is that a sensible business decision for me? And then thinking about when we're actually getting to the use of sex semen and breeding those replacements and the use of genomic technologies and all the technologies we've got available to us, what do I want my herd to look like? And those of you that work in the genetics game, and I've had the pleasure of getting to know you all a lot more over the last 2 years, you love to talk about traits, you love to talk about feet colour and leg angles and things like that, but actually there's some pretty higher level things to think about. What's the breed composition of my herd? Do I want a purebred herd or do I want a crossbred herd? And I was talking to Matt at lunchtime about a herd that their cows were getting too big and so they were thinking about going crossbred. And actually, is that what I want to do? And is that the best way to get there? What's the production that I want to be achieving? So Ross, in your area, you need to push your cows more where you're moving to house systems. It's not going to be economical to have a 450 kilogram milk solid cow in a housed system potentially. What's the mature size? Are they walking up and down hills in Glenalvie, or are they in a barn system? You can have a bigger cow in a barn system quite happily. And what's the calving pattern that's economic? So, am I a split calving herd because my reproductive performance is such that I have to be? And I know, that's a really big part of your PhD. What is the calving pattern that makes the most sense for my business? And what are the genetic decisions that I need to be able to achieve those things? So, whether or not they've got straight legs or a pretty udder or a high daughter fertility, actually what's the big picture stuff and where do I want my herd to be? And then the big question is how many, and that's really picking up what Jake said. What makes the most sense in terms of how many that I rear? And that's before you even start thinking about which traits that I'm going to select for. So when it comes to thinking about sex semen, bull selection, genomic selection, think about the big picture. Where do I want to be in 5 or 10 years' time? I'd encourage you to really jump on the back of that Our Farm Our Plan program and help farmers starting to think about more long-term, more strategically, where do they want to be? Do they want to move away from having non-replacement calves, Sarah? Do they want to move away from the bobby calf market? Is it economical for them to rear dairy beef? Okay, and then when we think about traits, we know from the NBO review, and I think that's reinforced really consistently through this work I've been doing with genomics as a non-genetic person. Farmers want cows that get in calf easily. They want cows that hang around. They don't want to be culling them because they've gone lame, Shona, or they've gone down. And actually farmers, and this is something that I'm really embarrassed to say that I used to just throw out, but actually farmers do really care about type. And as someone that worked in herd health, I didn't really care what the cow looked like as long as she was healthy, but it is really important to farmers and we can't discount that. And one of the things that I really wanted to emphasise is that you can think strategically about where you want to go, but it's critical that you actually take the time to regularly review that. And Matt Schaefer put up a picture of the Genetic Futures report, and I can't remember who else it was, had a picture of one of the genetic progress reports, and you see this zigzag that Matt Aitken was talking about. But it's really important to go, well, here's where I want to be every year. Is that still relevant? Has my business changed? Is there somewhere else I want to go? And actually, am I on track to get there? So utilising the industry tools to get there. And one of the cool things about our Farm Our Plan is actually that review process is embedded into the program. So what's your call to action? Jump in on our Farm Our Plan program if you have the opportunity to. And Michelle and I and the genomics team have got an action that I'm hoping to pick up very shortly, Michelle, to make sure that we're embedding some of that what does my herd look like into the Our Farm Our Plan program. I've had lots of conversations with Neil Webster and his team about that. Working with farmers, even if you're not going to use an existing industry program, when you're working with your farmers, and I think we've heard really from particularly the panel that Pete Williams managed earlier today, developing your vision and identifying the easiest and quickest and most efficient way to get to where you want to be as a farmer or as a service provider for that farmer. And use the tools that we have available, so whether that's genomics and sex semen and beef semen, use it strategically and make sure that it makes sense in terms of where you overall want to be in 5 or 10 years' time. And that's it. 5 minutes to go. We're trying to catch up a bit of time for you, JP.
Thanks, Sarah. Any questions for Steph or Sarah?
Thanks, guys. Sarah, it's a scary space you operate in. As we start to generate more of these targeted dairy beef calves, how do we convince old mate who's the cow-calf, got the cow-calf beef model going at the moment, how do we convince him to flip from that style of production over to rearing dairy beef calves?
So there's a few things in that, and I'm going to struggle to remember all the little dot points that are flying into my mind, but I'll scattergun approach it. So first of all, we're really fortunate in this country that our dairy industry is outnumbered by the beef herd by about 1 to 25, 26. So we're not really competing for places over beef chains like other countries, for example, New Zealand would be. So we know at the moment that beef prices are at record levels, and that's because, record numbers of beef breeder cows were culled during the 18-19 drought. But at some point that herd will rebuild and the demand will reduce. But it's not predicted that there'll be any sort of, strong competition of beef animals or dairy origin beef animals fighting for a place. Those that aren't bred well and fed well will be the first to be discounted though. So now is our opportunity to make sure that we're embedding good practices around ensuring we're breeding and feeding calves that the beef market wants. In terms of being a beef producer, certainly there are some nice carrots that sit around moving from a cow-calf operation to potentially purchasing, dairy origined weaned animals or even rearing pre-weaned animals. The first is around risk mitigation, and I mentioned the drought and the capital investment that you have in a beef breeder herd that, if you can't feed, you then have to send to the abattoir for what were horrific prices a few years ago. And the second piece is a possible one a little way down the track, which relates to on-farm carbon accounting. So we know from several European papers, as well as one recent New Zealand paper, that there's modelling been done overseas that shows that beef from the dairy herd can have a lower carbon footprint than beef that originates from a beef herd. And the simple calculation being that the carbon footprint of a product is the emissions of the breeder unit spread across her products. So a beef cow produces a beef calf each year for a given set of emissions, whilst a dairy cow could theoretically produce a beef cross calf as well as a few thousand litres of milk for a similar set of emissions, thereby reducing the overall carbon footprint of her products. As a beef farmer, if I'm looking to reduce my on-farm carbon accounting, I have the option of improving my efficiency, reducing my on-farm emissions, or purchasing lower carbon footprint inputs. And potentially, this is all potentially, a dairy origin weaner or calf could offer a lower carbon footprint input to a beef business than what a straight beef weaner could. This is potential down the track, but we know that these conversations are coming at us hard and fast. I probably had other things in my mind at the start, but I think that probably, I've waffled.
Hence the reason, hence the reason, Sarah, you did make a mention that dairy farmers may have to look at putting as much time into their beef program in terms of what Peter mentioned, the research. You can't just grab beef and say, that'll do.
Yep.
The beef industry is looking for a better product, aren't they?
Yeah, but we have to be realistic in that as well. So we know from social science that we've been doing that, and we all know this from working on and with dairy farms, that there's a huge spectrum when it comes to an individual dairy business's appetite for being a beef producer or otherwise. There are some dairy farms out there that want to diversify their portfolio, that want to breed beef animals and have them certified grass-fed and send them, straight to the abattoir and, be excellent beef producers as well as excellent dairy producers. And at the other end of the spectrum, there's dairy farms that don't want to rear any calves, including their replacement heifers, and just want to not deal with it and have the heifers come in at point of calving. So we as service providers and people that are supporting dairy farmers need to be able to cater to all of those needs. But the common point to everyone along that spectrum of dairy farmers is that they're putting a semen in, or they're putting a straw in a cow, usually. And that decision around whether or not this straw is going to produce a better beef animal that the market wants in poorer commodity prices as well as in good is one that every person can make all the way along.
Terrific. Thank you very much. Oh, sorry.
Just a quick question. Have you done any research about whether the market, whether it be supermarket or whatever, wants this dairy beef animal? Like, assuming you're going to get where does that sit in comparison to beef?
So we've been running a really cool project that we've been piloting on the New South Wales South Coast as part of the Dairy Up program, where we've been working with a few different, so it's social science based, so apologies to the biological data heads in the room, but we work with farmers, with service providers. We also work with what we call our supply chain stakeholder group, and so in there we have genetics companies, we have beef backgrounders, feedlotters, beef processors, milk processors, retailers and procurement in there as well. And so we've done individual interviews with all of those supply chain stakeholders going, okay, well, where's your stance on this whole issue? How does this work for you? And on the flip side, working with dairy farmers and on-farm advisors around where are you guys at? What are your challenges? What are your opportunities? And we also work with a community focus group in that project to make sure that we're ticking that social sustainability box in terms of, future evolved practices as well. So from a market perspective, there's very much a recognition of the social licence risk associated with early life slaughter. There's very much a desire to be involved with solutions. But whilst on one hand we often hear from dairy farmers, we just need someone to create us a market, just create us the magic market that we sell these calves into and problem solved kind of thing. On the flip side, the market's saying you just need to breed us and grow us the animals that we need. The markets already exists, you just need to hit the specs. Then in the middle, we have previous research that's looked at the beef quality or the meat quality and carcass traits of dairy origin animals on different growth pathways. And as I mentioned before, we know that we have to feed them properly in order to hit those specs. So the aim really in that project and in a lot of our approaches going forward is how can we better understand what does the community want, what does the consumer want, what does the market want and need, what are their challenges, what does the farmer want and need, what are their challenges, and how do we thread that together. So we're getting some inroads there, but that's our sort of next space, is helping dairy farmers better understand how they can meet the needs of the market, but equally helping the market better understand how they can help meet the needs of the dairy farmer.
All good? Thank you very much to Steph and to Sarah. Thanks very much.